Karen had always been the type of person who enjoyed being the center of attention. Whether it was at a party or a public event, she loved making people laugh with her daring pranks and jokes. She had a certain charm about her, always the life of the party, always surrounded by a crowd. She would do anything to make others laugh, and her sense of humor often went a little too far, but she never thought much of it. It was just her way of getting noticed, of making sure everyone remembered her. On this particular day, there was an event taking place in the heart of the city. Something grand, something that would draw a lot of people. It was a special occasion, and the Royal Guard were stationed throughout the area to maintain security and keep the crowd under control. As Karen wandered through the bustling streets, her mind began to wander as well. She was looking for her next bit of excitement, her next big laugh. That's when it hit her, an idea for a prank that she thought would be absolutely hilarious. She had seen the Royal Guard standing tall and serious, their expressions unmoving as they watched the crowd. They looked so stiff, so formal, almost out of place in the middle of such an animated crowd. That's when Karen got the idea. She had a bottle with her, something she had been carrying for a while now, filled with a harmless liquid she had picked up from a street vendor earlier. It was supposed to be a fun addition to her pranks, just a little something that could add a surprise to the moment. She thought, what if I splash this on one of the guards? Surely they'll get a good laugh out of it. It's all in good fun, right? She looked around to see if anyone was watching, hoping she could make this prank happen without anyone getting in her way. Her friends were nearby, laughing and talking among themselves, oblivious to what Karen was planning. Karen gave them a quick glance and smiled. This would be the perfect way to show off her sense of humor. She approached the Royal Guard, who stood on the edge of the crowd, his back straight and his gaze focused forward, as if he didn't even notice the world around him. She moved quickly, carefully hiding the bottle in her hand. With a sudden burst of excitement, she splashed the liquid from the bottle onto the guard's face. The liquid hit him squarely, and for a moment, everything went still. The guard froze, his eyes wide with surprise. Karen couldn't help but laugh. She thought it was funny, seeing his face get splashed with the liquid. It wasn't a lot, just enough to get his attention. But she had thought it would be harmless. After all, it was just a joke, right? But as the seconds passed, Karen noticed something strange. The guard's face twisted in pain, his hand going to his eyes as if trying to clear something away. He started to stagger back, his legs weakening beneath him. That's when Karen's laughter began to fade. A chill ran down her spine as she realized that the situation wasn't as funny as she had thought. The liquid she had thrown wasn't harmless at all. It was something far worse. The guard collapsed to the ground, his body jerking as he fell to his knees. People around him started to shout, calling for help. Karen stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. What had she done? This wasn't a prank anymore. The crowd's laughter turned into panic, with people rushing to the guard's side, trying to assist him. Karen's mind raced, and the reality of what she had just done slowly sank in. She had thought it would be funny, a harmless joke. But now it was clear she had made a huge mistake. The guard wasn't laughing. No one was laughing. Only chaos and confusion filled the air. Karen stood there, stunned, as the gravity of the situation set in. Her friends started to notice, their faces quickly turning from amusement to shock as they saw what had happened. One of them stepped forward, trying to get Karen's attention, but she was too caught up in her thoughts to listen. She never imagined something so serious could result from such a small action. What was once an innocent prank now felt like a terrible, unforgivable mistake. The scene quickly spiraled into chaos. Karen stood there, her legs frozen in place as her mind raced to make sense of what was happening. The Royal Guard, who had once seemed so unmovable and stern, was now on the ground, writhing in pain. His hands pressed against his face, his body trembling, and his breathing coming in sharp, panicked gasps. Around him, the crowd began to react in shock. People screamed for help, calling out to anyone who could assist. Some ran to the guard's side, while others backed away, unsure of what to do. Karen could hardly breathe. The laughter she had felt moments ago turned into a knot of dread in her stomach. She had thought the liquid she had thrown at the guard was harmless, something funny, something that would make people laugh. But now she realized the truth. What she had done was much more serious than she ever imagined. The guard's pain was not something that could be fixed with a quick laugh. The situation had escalated beyond her control. As the guard continued to writhe on the ground, people around him started to shout for medical assistance. Someone called an ambulance, while others tried to keep the crowd from getting too close. A few bystanders tried to help the guard, but their hands were shaking, and they didn't know what to do either. It was clear that the situation was bad, really bad. Karen's heart pounded in her chest, her thoughts racing as she struggled to understand what she had just done. She had been caught up in the excitement of the moment, trying to pull off the perfect joke. But now she was staring at the consequences of her actions, and she could feel the weight of her mistake sinking in. Panic slowly began to take over, and Karen felt the eyes of the crowd turn toward her. Her friends, who had been laughing just moments ago, now stood in stunned silence. They were no longer smiling, their faces filled with disbelief and concern. Karen's mind tried to make sense of everything, but all she could focus on was the guard's agonizing condition. A couple of people began to whisper, their voices filled with confusion and judgment. What happened to him? What did she do? One person asked, unable to understand the gravity of the situation. Karen's stomach churned at the whispers. She wanted to explain, to tell them that it was a joke, that she never meant for any of this to happen. But the words caught in her throat, and she could barely speak. What could she say to make them understand? How could she make them see that it had all been a mistake? The guard's cries grew louder, and Karen felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. She took a hesitant step forward, but before she could get any closer, a few people from the crowd rushed to her side. "Stay back," one of them said sharply, his voice filled with authority. "Don't touch anything. You've already caused enough trouble." His words stung, and Karen could feel the shame and guilt wash over her like a wave. She had gone from being the center of attention, the one everyone looked to for laughs, to someone who was now being cast aside, blamed for what had happened. It didn't take long for the paramedics to arrive, their sirens blaring as they pulled up to the scene. The crowd parted to let them through, and the professionals quickly took charge. They rushed to the royal guard, carefully examining his condition and administering first aid. Karen stood in the background, watching helplessly as they worked. She knew she had to stay out of their way, but every part of her wanted to do something, anything, to fix this. But there was nothing she could do. The damage had been done. As the guard was carefully loaded into the ambulance, Karen felt a chill run down her spine. The reality of the situation hit her full force. She had hurt someone, not just physically, but emotionally as well. Her carefree attitude, the one that had always led her to joke around and laugh, had led to something she couldn't take back. The ambulance sped off into the distance, and the crowd slowly began to disperse. Some people still lingered, whispering among themselves about what had just happened. Karen's friends, too, started to walk away, giving her strange, concerned glances as they went. No one was laughing anymore. No one was interested in her pranks or her jokes. All that remained was a stunned silence, and a heavy weight that Karen could not escape. As she stood alone in the middle of the street, Karen felt a sinking feeling in her chest. She knew her life was about to change forever, and there was no way to undo what had just happened. The following days after the incident were a blur for Karen. She could hardly focus on anything, her mind consumed by the events that had unfolded in those few horrifying moments. The splash of liquid, the guard collapsing, the frantic calls for help. Everything replayed in her mind, over and over. She kept asking herself the same question. Why did I think it would be funny? But there was no answer that could make sense of what had happened. It didn't take long for the news of the incident to spread. What had once been a simple prank between friends quickly turned into a nationwide scandal. Every news outlet, both on TV and online, picked up the story. Headlines flashed across screens. Woman hurts Royal Guard in joke gone wrong, and prank turns tragic. What happens when humor crosses the line? Karen felt the sting of each word as they hit her like a wave. It wasn't just the media's judgment that overwhelmed her, but the judgment of everyone around her. People she barely knew, people who had once smiled and waved at her on the street, were now whispering behind her back. The royal family, who had always been respected and admired, issued a public statement condemning the attack. The statement expressed the family's concern for the guard's well-being, emphasizing how serious the consequences of such an act were. This only added fuel to the fire. Karen's name was everywhere, and not in a way she ever wanted. She had gone from being a familiar face at social gatherings to a symbol of recklessness. She had become a cautionary tale, a warning to others about what could happen when a joke went too far. The Royal Guard, who had once stood tall and proud, was now in the hospital, his condition critical. Karen learned from the news reports that he had suffered severe burns and damage to his eyes, and doctors were uncertain if he would fully recover. The weight of that information crushed Karen's spirit. She had never intended for anyone to get hurt, least of all someone in a position of such authority and respect. But her actions, though impulsive, had led to far-reaching consequences. She couldn't stop thinking about the guard, lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, while she was out there facing the consequences of her careless joke. Her friends, who had once laughed along with her pranks, now looked at her with a mixture of disbelief and concern. Some of them reached out to make sure she was okay, but Karen couldn't help but feel like they were doing it out of obligation, not genuine care. They had all seen what had happened, and they knew it wasn't just a silly prank. The damage was real, and it was affecting everyone involved, not just Karen. No one was laughing anymore. In fact, it was hard to find any sense of humor in the aftermath. The guilt started to eat at her from the inside. Karen found herself unable to escape the constant weight pressing down on her. She had no peace of mind, no quiet moments to herself without the nagging thoughts of what had happened. She couldn't go anywhere without seeing a mention of the incident. Every time she checked her phone, she saw the headlines. Every time she went outside, she could feel the stares of people who recognized her, their eyes filled with judgment. It wasn't just the public reaction that weighed on her, it was the uncertainty of what was to come next. The police had begun an investigation into the incident, and Karen knew that the legal consequences would be severe. She could already imagine the charges being brought against her: assault, attempted harm, and maybe even more serious charges depending on how things played out with the guard's recovery. The court of public opinion had already decided what they thought of her actions, but soon it would be the real court that would judge her. And Karen knew the consequences there could change her life forever. Her family, too, was struggling with the fallout. They didn't understand how something like this could have happened. Karen had always been the one to get attention in the family, but this wasn't the type of attention anyone wanted. Her parents were disappointed, upset, and unsure of how to handle the situation. They loved her, but they couldn't ignore the gravity of what she had done. Their conversations with her were filled with sadness and regret, as if the person they had raised no longer resembled the woman standing before them. Karen's actions had not only affected her but had rippled out to touch the lives of everyone around her. She felt isolated, trapped in a world of regret. All she wanted was to go back to that moment, to take back the joke and stop herself before it was too late. But time didn't work that way. The consequences had already begun to unfold, and now Karen had to face them head-on, knowing she could never undo the harm she had caused. As the days went by, the pressure on Karen continued to grow. The investigation into the incident was in full swing, and she could feel the weight of the authorities closing in. The police had started gathering evidence, speaking to witnesses, and reviewing the surveillance footage from the area where everything had happened. Every time Karen saw the news or heard a conversation, she felt a sense of dread wash over her. It was clear that no matter how hard she tried to explain herself, the consequences of her actions were too serious to ignore. Karen had hired a lawyer, a professional who had dealt with cases like hers before, but even the lawyer's calm demeanor couldn't ease her anxiety. The legal proceedings ahead felt like an inevitable storm, one she could not escape. The lawyer explained the situation to her, and although he was trying to be optimistic, Karen couldn't shake the feeling that everything was spiraling out of control. He told her that the charges could range from assault to a more severe charge depending on the guard's condition. If the guard didn't recover fully, Karen could face much harsher consequences. Her heart sank as the weight of her mistake settled deeper. Despite her lawyer's reassurance that they would work to minimize the charges, Karen couldn't escape the guilt and fear. She knew it would be hard to explain that the whole thing had been a joke gone wrong. The public, and even the authorities, weren't going to view her actions as an innocent mistake. How could they? The damage had been done, and the royal guard's life was hanging in the balance. Karen couldn't stop thinking about him. The image of him collapsing, writhing in pain, haunted her day and night. What if he didn't make it? What if she was the reason for his suffering? Her friends, once so supportive and full of laughter, now avoided her or barely spoke to her. Some tried to reach out with words of comfort, but their voices were always distant, as though they were unsure of how to deal with the situation. They had seen it all unfold in real time, and no matter how much they tried to soften the blow, Karen knew they were disappointed in her. The phone calls, the messages, they all carried an unspoken judgment. They didn't need to say much for Karen to feel the shift. It wasn't just about the prank anymore. It was about the hurt she had caused and the consequences of her actions that no one could escape. Karen's family was also struggling. Her parents, who had always been proud of her outgoing personality and her sense of humor, now found themselves at a loss. They didn't know how to help her. They didn't know what to say. The love they had for her was still there, but it was clouded by confusion and disappointment. They had always taught her right from wrong, but this time there was no easy explanation for the mess she had created. Her mother cried quietly in the kitchen, while her father sat at the table, staring at the floor. Karen could see the sadness in their eyes, and it only made her feel worse. The worst part for Karen was the growing realization that no matter how much she apologized, no matter how much she regretted her actions, the world had already moved on. People were already forming opinions about her, opinions she couldn't change. And while she was consumed with guilt, others were quick to pass judgment. The media had made sure to keep the story alive, and every new article added to the weight she carried. She knew that her reputation, the carefree woman who always knew how to make people laugh, was shattered. In its place was a story of a reckless, thoughtless individual whose joke had hurt someone deeply. As she sat alone in her room, Karen thought about the future. Would she ever be able to move past this? Would she ever be able to find peace with herself? She didn't know what was going to happen next, but she knew she would have to face the consequences of her actions, no matter how painful that would be. All she could do was wait and hope that somehow things would work out. But deep down, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The day of the trial arrived, and Karen was filled with a mixture of dread and nervousness. She had never imagined that something so small, a prank intended to make people laugh, would turn her life upside down. Now, as she stood in the courtroom, she realized the seriousness of the situation. The judge, the attorneys, the witnesses, all the eyes were on her, and the weight of the moment was unbearable. Karen sat in the defendant's chair, her hands clasped tightly together, trying to steady her nerves. The room was tense, the silence thick as everyone waited for the proceedings to begin. She glanced around at the people in the courtroom, her lawyer, who had been advising her through the process, and the prosecutor, who looked determined to make sure she paid for what she had done. And then there were the people who had been affected by her actions. The royal family had sent representatives to the trial, their faces grave as they sat in the back of the room, their presence a constant reminder of the severity of the situation. Karen couldn't help but feel the weight of their gaze. The charges against her were serious. The prosecutor made it clear that her actions had not only caused harm, but had also endangered a man's life. He painted the situation in the most dire light possible, speaking about the injuries the royal guard had suffered, the pain he had endured, and the emotional toll on him. The royal family's representative spoke as well, describing the impact on the royal guard and how his life had been changed in ways no one could have imagined. Karen listened carefully, the words cutting through her like a knife. She had never meant for this to happen. It was supposed to be a joke, a harmless prank. But now, the consequences were clear, and they were something she couldn't deny. When it was Karen's turn to speak, her heart raced. She stood up slowly, her legs feeling like they were made of jelly. She knew she had to say something. She couldn't just sit there and let the trial unfold without offering some explanation. But what could she say? How could she explain that something so small had turned into something so much larger? With her voice trembling, she began. She spoke about how the prank had been intended as nothing more than a joke, how she had never meant for the guard to get hurt. She described how she thought the liquid would be harmless, how she hadn't even considered the possible consequences. But as the words left her mouth, Karen knew that they sounded hollow. She knew that no matter how much she explained herself, the damage had already been done. She could hear the murmurs of the courtroom, the skepticism in the air. She could see the way the people around her were reacting, some with pity, others with judgment. Her lawyer tried to soften the situation, presenting Karen as someone who had acted out of character, someone who had made a mistake but didn't deserve the full force of the law. But even as he spoke, Karen could feel the weight of the room's disapproval. The jury listened carefully, their eyes focused on her as she spoke, and she felt small and insignificant under their gaze. She tried to hold it together, but it was clear that the impact of her actions couldn't be undone by words alone. The trial continued, with witnesses giving their testimony about what had happened that day. Some spoke about the panic that had followed the incident, the confusion, and the fear that had spread among the crowd. Others talked about how the guard had fought to stay conscious, how he had been rushed to the hospital in critical condition. Each testimony added to the weight of Karen's guilt. The reality of what she had done became clearer with every word spoken. It wasn't just a prank gone wrong. It was a life-altering mistake. Karen's mind was spinning, her emotions raw as she tried to process everything happening around her. She couldn't escape the images of the royal guard lying in pain on the ground, the fear in his eyes as he collapsed. The shame she felt in that moment was overwhelming, and it didn't matter how much she wanted to undo it all. She knew that there was no going back. She had crossed a line, and no matter how much she regretted it, the consequences were hers to face. The trial moved forward, but Karen couldn't focus on the details. She was too lost in her own thoughts, trying to understand how everything had gone so terribly wrong. As the trial continued, she knew that the hardest part was yet to come, the judgment. Would the court see her as a person who made a tragic mistake, or would they see her as someone deserving of the harshest consequences? She couldn't predict the outcome, but all she knew was that her life, her future, hung in the balance. As the trial continued, Karen found herself sinking deeper into a pit of anxiety and uncertainty. Each day felt like a long, drawn-out battle, with every word spoken in court feeling like another blow to her already shattered sense of self. The evidence against her seemed to grow stronger, and despite her lawyer's best efforts to present her as someone who had acted out of character, Karen couldn't escape the gravity of the situation. The royal guard's condition remained critical, and it was clear that his recovery would be long and difficult. Doctors were still unsure about the full extent of his injuries, and his family had remained tight-lipped about the details. But the damage was evident. The once sturdy figure of a royal guard, known for his strength and composure, was now a symbol of the consequences of Karen's actions. Every time Karen heard an update on his condition, it felt like another weight was added to her already heavy heart. The courtroom was filled with tense moments as the prosecution continued to argue that Karen's actions had been reckless, a serious breach of public safety. They painted a picture of a woman who had acted without thinking, causing harm to a man who was simply doing his job. Karen's heart ached as she listened to the statements, knowing that every word had been true. She had been careless. She had never once thought about the potential consequences of what she was doing when she splashed the liquid on the guard. It had been a joke in her mind, a silly prank. But now, in the cold light of the courtroom, it was a nightmare. The prosecution called more witnesses to the stand, each one giving a detailed account of the events that had unfolded that day. Some spoke about the panic in the crowd, the confusion and fear that followed the guard's collapse. Others described how they had tried to help, but it was clear that the situation was beyond anyone's control. The images in Karen's mind began to blur with the descriptions she heard, the chaos, the screams, the helplessness. She couldn't erase it from her memory. When it was the defense's turn to speak, Karen's lawyer worked hard to frame the situation as a tragic mistake, rather than a deliberate act of malice. He spoke of Karen's character, how she had always been a well-meaning person who had made a terrible error in judgment. He even presented evidence of Karen's previous good deeds, hoping to paint a picture of a woman who had simply let her impulses get the better of her. But the prosecution countered this with hard facts: the severity of the guard's injuries, the pain he had endured, and the lasting impact on his life. Karen could feel the gap between her side and the prosecution's side widening. There seemed to be no way to undo what had been done. During the breaks in the trial, Karen sat in the quiet of the courtroom, her mind racing. She couldn't stop thinking about the royal guard. Every detail about his suffering felt like a knife twisting in her chest. She couldn't escape the thought that she had ruined his life, perhaps irreparably. She thought about the people she had hurt, the embarrassment she had caused her family, and the deep regret that now filled every waking moment. No matter how much she wanted to turn back time, she knew it wasn't possible. As the trial moved into its final stages, the judge prepared to give his closing remarks. Karen sat in her chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to steady the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She had tried to explain herself. She had tried to show the court that she wasn't a bad person, that she hadn't intended to cause harm. But as the trial drew to a close, it was clear that her fate was out of her hands. The courtroom felt heavier than ever, and Karen realized that the moment of judgment was fast approaching. Would the court show mercy, understanding that she had made a mistake that she would regret for the rest of her life? Or would they see her as someone deserving of the harshest punishment for her reckless actions? Karen couldn't know for sure, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened, her life would never be the same again. The consequences of her actions would follow her for the rest of her life, no matter the outcome of the trial. The weight of that knowledge settled on her shoulders as she waited for the final verdict. The day Karen had been dreading finally arrived. The moment when the court would issue its verdict. She had spent the night before in a restless daze, tossing and turning in her bed, replaying the trial in her mind. What would the judge say? How would the jury react? There were so many possibilities, and each one seemed to send her into deeper waves of anxiety. It felt as though her life was hanging by a thread, and she was powerless to stop the inevitable. The courtroom was tense, even more so than before. The seats were filled, the murmurs of the spectators filling the air. Karen sat quietly in the defendant's chair, trying her best to remain calm, but her heart was pounding in her chest. Her lawyer was beside her, his face solemn as he reviewed the documents in front of him. She could see the worry in his eyes. He had worked so hard for her defense, but even he knew the reality of the situation. The case was complicated. It wasn't just about the guard's injuries, but also about the impact Karen's actions had on the entire community. The judge entered the courtroom, and everyone stood in silence. As he took his seat, Karen's nerves tightened even more. The room fell silent as the judge cleared his throat and began to speak. His voice was firm, measured, and full of authority. He started by summarizing the details of the case, reminding everyone of the severity of the situation, the pain the royal guard had endured, the public outrage that had followed, and the consequences of Karen's impulsive actions. Karen listened intently, her mind racing. Everything the judge said felt like a reminder of her mistake. She had been so careless, so thoughtless in that moment, and now the repercussions were unfolding before her. It was hard to believe that her life had come to this. A joke, meant to be funny, had turned into a tragedy, and now she had to face the reality of what she had done. The judge then spoke about the defense and the arguments presented. He acknowledged that Karen had never intended to cause harm, that it had been an unfortunate accident. But he also pointed out the seriousness of the act. In the eyes of the law, intent wasn't always enough. What mattered was the harm caused and the recklessness involved. Karen knew that the judge had a point. No matter how much she wished it had been different, she had still made a decision that had led to someone suffering. Finally, the judge turned to the matter of sentencing. He spoke about the guard's condition, how he was still recovering, the physical and emotional toll the injury had taken on him. The judge didn't mince words. He emphasized that the court had to send a clear message about the consequences of actions like Karen's. It was clear that her actions had impacted more than just the guard. They had affected everyone who had witnessed the incident, everyone who had been shaken by what had happened. The message, the judge said, needed to be strong. Karen's heart sank. She had been hoping for some leniency, some understanding, but it was becoming clear that the court wasn't going to go easy on her. Her lawyer leaned over to her and gave her a brief, reassuring glance, but Karen could see the worry in his eyes. It was the moment of truth. The judge paused, looking down at the papers in front of him. The room was silent, and Karen could hear her own breathing, shallow and quick. She didn't know what to expect. Would she be sentenced to prison? Would she have to pay restitution? The uncertainty of the outcome was like a storm cloud hanging over her head. Finally, the judge spoke. He declared that Karen was guilty of reckless endangerment and assault, but he also acknowledged that she had shown genuine remorse for her actions. The judge's words weren't harsh, but they weren't comforting either. He sentenced Karen to a period of community service and required her to attend counseling to address her impulsive behavior. While the sentence wasn't as severe as it could have been, it was still a heavy blow. Karen was to be held accountable for her actions, but the judge had also given her a chance to make amends. As the judge spoke the final words of the verdict, Karen sat still, her mind trying to process what had just happened. She wasn't going to prison, but she wasn't free either. The reality of the sentence was a bittersweet relief. She had been given a chance to prove she could change, but that didn't erase the damage she had caused. The guilt and regret still weighed heavily on her, and the knowledge that the Royal Guard's life would never be the same left a hollow feeling in her chest. Karen's lawyer whispered to her, offering his congratulations for avoiding a harsher sentence. But Karen didn't feel victorious. She felt empty. The road ahead was uncertain, and she knew that it would take more than just community service to fix the damage she had caused. The judgment had been delivered, but the hardest part was yet to come, finding a way to live with the consequences of her actions and trying to rebuild the trust she had lost, both in herself and in others. The days following the trial were filled with mixed emotions for Karen. She had been given a second chance, but the weight of the judgment still lingered. The sentence wasn't as harsh as it could have been, but that didn't make her feel any less guilty for what she had done. The Royal Guard's recovery was still uncertain, and no matter how much time passed, the image of him lying on the ground in pain stayed in her mind, like a shadow she couldn't escape. Karen began her community service, but it felt more like a punishment than a chance at redemption. She spent her days helping at local charities, cleaning up parks, and assisting in various community projects. It wasn't the kind of work she was used to, but it gave her a chance to reflect on what had happened. Each task, no matter how small, felt like a reminder of the responsibility she now carried. Every day, she was reminded that her actions had consequences, not just for herself, but for the people around her, especially the Royal Guard. At night, Karen would lie in bed and think about the trial, the verdict, and everything she had lost. She had once been a person who lived for the moment, someone who thrived on laughter and attention. But now, that part of her felt distant. She couldn't help but feel like she had destroyed the version of herself that had made those jokes, that had enjoyed the thrill of making others laugh. The laughter was gone now, replaced by a quiet loneliness that filled the space around her. Her family, while supportive, had become distant. They didn't understand the depth of the guilt she felt, and though they tried to offer comfort, their concern only served to remind her of what she had done. Karen felt like an outsider in her own home, a person who no longer fit the mold of who she used to be. She had let them down, and no amount of apologies could fix that. Her mother often gave her gentle hugs, and her father would sit in silence beside her. But Karen knew that the trust they had once had in her was broken. She wasn't the daughter they had raised. She was a woman who had made an unforgivable mistake. Her friends, too, had begun to pull away. Some tried to reach out, but the conversations were strained, awkward. They were no longer laughing at her jokes or enjoying her company the way they once had. Some of them didn't understand how serious the situation was, while others simply couldn't get past the image of what she had done. Karen knew that the trust between them was shattered, and it seemed impossible to fix. She missed the camaraderie, the carefree moments they had shared, but she also knew that it would take time, if it ever happened at all, for things to return to normal. As the weeks turned into months, Karen began to change in ways she hadn't anticipated. The counseling sessions mandated by the court helped her realize that her actions were not just a result of a careless moment, but a pattern of behavior. She had always acted impulsively, always pushed the boundaries of what was acceptable, thinking that the consequences would never catch up with her. But now, the consequences were here, and they were a lot harder to ignore. Karen began to examine her own behavior more critically. She realized that her need for attention, her constant search for validation through jokes and pranks, had clouded her judgment for too long. She had always been someone who thrived on excitement, on being the center of attention, but now she understood that there was more to life than just the thrill of the moment. She had taken the joy of making others laugh and twisted it into something harmful. She had forgotten that every action has a consequence, that humor should never come at the expense of someone else's well-being. One afternoon, as Karen was volunteering at a community center, she found herself talking to a young boy who was shy and withdrawn. She noticed how he seemed to shrink into himself, avoiding eye contact, unsure of his place in the world. In that moment, Karen realized that she had once been like him, someone who tried to fit in, to be noticed, without understanding the damage she was doing to herself and others. She took a deep breath and approached the boy, speaking to him gently, helping him find his confidence. It wasn't much, but it was the first step in understanding the true meaning of connection, of helping others without needing to be the center of attention. As time passed, Karen began to find a new sense of purpose. It wasn't the same as before. She no longer craved the spotlight or the laughter of others. Instead, she found satisfaction in the quiet moments, in the work she did to make amends for her past. She didn't know if she would ever fully heal from the damage she had caused, but she understood now that healing wasn't about erasing the past. It was about learning from it, taking responsibility, and finding a way to move forward with humility and grace. The royal guard, who had once seemed like an untouchable figure, was slowly recovering, though his life would never be the same. Karen never had the chance to speak to him directly, but she often thought about him and hoped that, somehow, he would be able to find peace. She knew she couldn't undo the pain she had caused, but she hoped that, in time, the memory of that day would fade, replaced by healing and understanding. Karen's life had been forever changed by one impulsive action, but she had learned something important in the process. Redemption was possible, but it required patience, effort, and a willingness to change. It was a long road ahead, and she knew there would be challenges along the way. But for the first time in months, Karen felt a small glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to rebuild her life and become the person she was meant to be.